So this presentation came about because we have been in meetings with the Division of Water Quality, and we met with the Water Quality Board to talk about PFAS, which is polyfluoroalkyl substances. It's the big pollutant of concern that people are talking about. It's simply called a forever chemical. I'll explain that in a minute. Um, PFAS is this practically, in many cases, indestructible compound that's created with carbon and fluorine bonds and then bonded to some other groups like sulfonate, phosphate, or carboxylate. And these groups are very difficult to break. They're great products uh, for what they originally were intended for, beginning in the 40s and 50s, but they are now of concern because they show some level of toxicity for cancer and other potential problems. And so, because of that, uh, we're worried about them. People are worried about them. If you looked at a popcorn, microwave popcorn bag, you would see lots of PFAS. You just don't know it's there because it's not on the list of chemicals you're going to be eating, but it is there. Um, And the next question is, why are we concerned about it? Well, it's because it's in all of these consumer products. In our world, in the wastewater, almost all of the PFAS that we see at wastewater treatment plants come from consumer products. We don't have manufacturers in Utah. We have a little bit of use by industry. We also have had in the past some substantial use in firefighting foam, but most of it, again, is coming out of consumer products that probably everyone on this meeting today uses. It's called a forever chemical because it just doesn't break down. And there's like anywhere from 6 to 800 to 6,000 different varieties of PFAS. And some are very resistant to breakdown. Others break down over a lot less time, but none of them break down quickly. They have a number of studies were done. The group of studies called the CH studies were done in the early 2000s, where they were talking about what the harms were, and these were studies that were centered around PFAS use and manufacturing and highly concentrated amounts of it in both drinking water, groundwater, as well as in food that was found in that area. And so there's just a huge amount of potential impacts, most of which have been associated with highly concentrated locations thus far in terms of study. So we had two really nasty PFAS characters. One was PFOA and the other was PFOS. And they each did something different. And those have been essentially in the US, their use has been curtailed. It doesn't mean we still don't get new products coming in that have it, but they're not being manufactured in the United States. And so everybody thought, well, let's transition away from that. And they went to other PFAS variants, two of which are called Gen X and PFBS, which are not quite as bad, but again, not what you would call the ideal chemical to have around. This is a quick chart that says what's the status of it. The red boxes, both PFOA and PFOS are being either phased out or being phased out, but PFBS and Gen X are still in heavy use. Both PFOA and PFOS have high bioaccumulation, and the other two have low to moderate accumulation. Then the half-life, and this is the key, is that PFOA and PFOS were years before they could break down or dissipate, whereas the other ones are days to weeks. But again, they all have some degree of linkage to some of these health problems that have been identified. The biggest problem we face when we look at it from a regulatory standpoint is that there is a lot of science centered around high concentrations of it in the environment or in in, for instance, drinking water, but very limited amount about it at very low concentrations. And so using modeling techniques and the precautionary principle, they've moved forward with some limited amount of regulatory effort on it. I like to say it's so little done, but so much to do if we really want to understand this pollutant. The National Drinking Water Standards was the first and only actual regulatory limits established for PFAS, and those limits are at 4 parts per trillion. That's per trillion. Now, those limits were set based upon the lowest measurable concentration. If you look at the right-hand side of this graph, the actual limit that they did from the modeling was, totally indistinguishable. 9/10,000ths of a part per trillion, for instance, on PFOA. So again, when we use modeling to look at the health impacts, it is significant down to very low concentrations. In the wastewater world, the place where we're looking at it closely is in biosolids. Biosolids are the solids residual that's generated from wastewater treatment. And some of the PFAS concentrations partition to the biosolids. There are some that are more water soluble and some that are more solid surface liking. And so some partition to the biosolids more than others. This is a graphic that shows the risk in it. We get it from all the sources out there, people primarily coming into the plants. And biosolids are created daily. Every day we create biosolids. Can't stop that process unless we don't want to treat the wastewater. And so we're going to create those biosolids. And across the country, most of it are land applied. Some is monofilled and a little bit less is incinerated. In Utah, it's almost all land applied, with a little bit going into land filling. But those land applied biosolids can then accumulate PFAS from them, if there's a high enough concentration, into different food groups. Fish is one. If the water body is contaminated, fish pick up a lot of PFAS. And then it gets to people. And so the concern is, what do we do and where do we go with biosolids? So this study talked about it in sewage sludge, and what it found was that they are consistently, PFOA and PFOS, again, these are the two nasties, are consistently detected in sewage sludge at almost every wastewater treatment plant. So they're not going to be, they're there and they're not going to go away easily because those products that contain them are still being used across our consumer world. So in this document, this risk assessment document, they looked at what they considered the most exposed individual, which is a very worst case scenario, but it said, what level do we need to keep it in biosolids to avoid any risk to that most exposed individual? This is a person who drinks milk off of the farm they farm, where there's been biosolids application for 40 years, where they drink the water out of a pond that's contaminated from the land, and they eat the food off of their farm, and they, oh, by the way, they eat fish from that pond. And so that most exposed individual could be protected at 1 part per billion in the biosolids. Unfortunately, very few, if any, biosolids ever reach down to 1 part per billion. And so there's been a lot of things going on relative to this nationwide, a lot of discussion, but other than at the state level, action hasn't been taken on a national level, particularly yet, to determine what to do. The risk assessment was draft format, and that where it is today after a year and a half of time. Typically in wastewater, PFOA ranges from 1 to 200. PFOS ranges from 10 to 1100. In Utah, it's lower than that because we don't have any manufacturers and we have a very low amount of it other than from consumer products. But if you look on the right-hand side of this graph, they're not only are they in biosolids, but they're in manure, they're in soils, they're practically everywhere. In fact, in a study done in the CH studies, it found that 97% of all blood has measurable PFAS in it from humans. Utah has done a number of studies. We've looked at it in terms of where we are today. Our PFOA concentrations are very low, 4.3 parts per billion, and our PFOS is 11.92 parts per billion. Again, low compared to the national averages, but still detectable and still over the risk threshold for that most exposed individual. When we look into the massive black hole as to where regulations are going today, there's very little likelihood that this rule will ever completely go away, even though there are over 10,000 comments on it when it was submitted for public comment. But it is likely that it will change. Just where and how much, no one knows yet. And it's very unlikely that it will be implemented the way it is. And also, even though those numbers are there at very low concentrations, it's very little been done to try and translate that into limits for biosolids and for beneficial reuse of biosolids. So this is a concern for us in the wastewater industry, and I'll tell you why. It's not because we're worried that EPA is going to impose a limit immediately and we're going to be out of luck on what to do with our biosolids, although that's a risk. It really is because of lawsuits that are being promulgated across the country right now. In Texas, there's a major epicenter for it where they had chemical manufacturers with significant concentrations land applying. And those have now shown up at very high concentrations. If you look at the upper right-hand corner, up to 84,000 parts per trillion. Again, that's parts per trillion, so that's still very low in terms of the parts per million, but a lot compared to the average. It showed up in animal tissue, and because of that, there's a lot of lawsuits going on about who should compensate ground that's been contaminated or animal production that's been lost. Most of those lawsuits are aimed today at the manufacturers of the material. But that doesn't preclude the wastewater facility because it is a passive receiver still getting included in the lawsuits. You know, the defense for this is that simply this is a great product. It's very useful. We can't just live without it. And quite honestly, there are some places where you can't live without it. If anybody's ever had a lot of an implant, for instance, a pacemaker, or any other medical implants, those are highly concentrated PFAS in those because then they won't break down inside the body. States have also reached out to do some of the regulatory effort where the federal government has not done it yet. And this is what we are proposing with the Division of Water Quality, is that at the state level, we ought to look at some guidelines to manage it until federal guidance becomes available and actually usable. There are a couple of states who have banned it entirely, all biosolids land application, and now they hate themselves for doing that because they don't have enough landfill, they don't have enough places to put it. So instead of worried about putting it on their land, they're trying to export it back into Texas and other kind of states, Pennsylvania also, where they can put the biosolids while they wait to figure out what to do. That's not a very neighborly, nor is it a very good solution, but that's what Maine did. There are about 11 states that have got some kind of monitoring requirement, and there are several that have management trigger levels. So what should we do now? Well, first thing we're recommending is that the regulations need to include testing as a requirement. Today, there's no requirement for anyone to test for it. problem with a wastewater plant is if we're not required to test for it, it's very difficult for us to go back out and tell industrial users they have to test for it. Because Utah law states that we have to have a basis for making an industrial user do something. And without a testing requirement for us, we can't make that testing requirement cascade down to the industrial users. Secondly, we feel there should be some level of application concentration limits placed on it for beneficial reuse on land application. And there are a number of states who've centered around these limits and what those limits should be. So the takeaway from a study done looking at all of the action on a legislative level was that every state should and would benefit from having clear, understandable rules in place, and there needs to be a process, a deliberative process, to set standards that are achievable and realistic today, knowing that they might change in the future. The challenge you have is that from a PFAS standpoint, we could just say, well, let's get it out of the water and let's get it out of the biosolids. But you don't remove it easily from the water. So for the average homeowner in Utah, for us to remove it from the water is going to cost somewhere between $70 to $100 per month to meet a treatment level that can completely remove it from the wastewater. And then on top of that, there isn't a good way to remove it from biosolids. So what we're left with is some sort of a destruction technology for the biosolids, such as pyrolysis, where you can get it destructed at very high temperatures, but that has an extremely high cost also, between $30 and $50 more per month. So if we had to remove it from wastewater today and destruct it, everybody's sewer bill would go up by at least $125 to $150 a month. And most of the sewer workers would be hanging from trees. For a wastewater land application, we believe there's a path forward right now. That's to require testing and require target levels for sampling in order to do land application. And there's a good reason to do that. So that's what we're proposing as the Utah way, which is a copy of other states' ways, but we think it's a good way to go, is propose beneficial regulations to manage it in the interim, waiting for federal guidelines to be established. It'll help protect the public health. It'll help maintain the environment. It'll help continue to make wastewater treatment an affordable service. It also allows for us to establish on industries that use it local limits so that we can control how much they give us before we allow them to discharge. But even with that, no guarantee that future regulations won't drive us to a much higher cost. This is a copy of the regulation we proposed to the Water Quality Board. We are meeting with the Division of Water Quality, and they have a task force we're working on to come up with a final recommendation, but we believe it should be a simple regulation in R317-1-3 of the State Administrative Code, which first of all requires testing, and it's a reasonable amount of testing. This is similar to what biosolids requires anyway for both pathogens as well as heavy metals. And then secondly, we feel there should be established in the rule trigger levels. I can go into the logic as to why we're using the term trigger levels, because it has to do with state code requirements in Title 19-5, but suffice it to say, we don't want to make it limits today. We want to make it something people should act on, but a little bit softer than a limit. Application rates, as you get higher concentration, should be either reduced, curtailed, or completely eliminated. So what does all that mean for the Jordan River, since this is a Jordan River meeting? Well, somewhere around 80+% of all effluent PFAS stays in the water. So every bit of that material that comes to a wastewater treatment plant, 80% plus, is going right out into the Jordan River. And at times, the Jordan River has a substantial amount of wastewater to make up its flow. In addition to that, if you look at the right-hand side on this list, there are a lot of other sources for it. Urban stormwater runoff, including, like, for instance, roofing materials, asphaltic shingles. It gets leached off of those materials because it's in it. It can be off of asphalt. It can be litter from food packaging. You know, if I look at that popcorn bag, it's loaded with PFAS. It can be off of vehicle residuals. There are potential for direct industrial discharges that could be problematic. If there's any firefighting foam that might be getting into the river, it could come from that. One of the locations where the highest groundwater concentrations have been measured in Utah is under the Salt Lake City Airport. And that's principally because of firefighting foam. It can come off of landfill leachate because all of these products that we all bought that are laden with PFAS, if we stop using them, almost all end up in the landfill. And then it can leach into the groundwater from the landfill. It can come off of atmospheric deposition from dust, from particulate matter, and it even comes from contaminated groundwater, primarily again through leachate or other forms of contamination getting to the groundwater. So it's Jordan River is not going to not see it in the near future. There have been a number of studies done by USGS principally to look at it in urban tributaries and urban ecosystems. And these are 4 studies that we were able to find there. Pennsylvania, 76% of all samples, and they did a statewide study, 76% had PFAS in it. And these are urban, I'm not urban, but that's urban and rural waterways. Massachusetts, they only tested urban rivers, and almost every one of them had PFAS in it. The Rio Grande corridor, all of them were measured PFAS, and it was 10 times greater downstream of Albuquerque than it was upstream. And then in the Great Lakes, they all measured having PFAS in the ecosystems, and the urban areas were much, much greater than the rural stream segments. So it's all around us. The only question is, what do you do? So there are a lot of people right now who feels, just like this graphic says, we're all screwed. This forever chemical isn't going to go away. It's still being used, and it's toxic. So we're screwed. That's a pretty pessimistic viewpoint, but nonetheless, it's where a lot of people feel we're at. There are others who are more optimistic that it will sequester itself somewhere eventually if we stop using the products, or if we stop putting it into products that consumers buy. And we think that's the way it should be done, is to stop using the products and putting it into consumer goods. In the meantime, we're going to have to wait for it to continue to go down naturally in the environment. I mentioned in the blood of humans that, especially in areas where the contamination was high, the blood concentration was very high. But subsequent to those original measurements, it's gone down in many cases almost 80%. And then on top of that, the studies have indicated that if you have decent pre-treatment to control industrial discharges, if there are industrial components to it where they've had high concentrations, you can make 90% of the wastewater load go away by just controlling industrial users. So there is an optimistic viewpoint that we're screwed, but not totally and forever. Our recommendation is to move forward with that. And based on that, we are also pursuing a mechanism to try and reduce the risk for people and for us as facilities. And this is a collective biosolids land application program. Brandon's going to talk a little bit about that.
Thanks, Leland. Appreciate that. Yes, I'm Brandon Heidelberger, Assistant GM for Central Valley. Unfortunately, my camera's not working, so you'll just have to take my word for it that I'm fully dressed. I'm not in my pajamas, but love to walk through these slides that were given last month at the Water Quality Board meeting that Phil Heck, the general manager here in Leland, presented. And I'll hit the highlights because I know you guys have some time constraints. Just a little bit about Central Valley. We are a 50 MGD, or average about 50 million gallons per day wastewater treatment here at Central Valley. We're located at 3300 South and 9th West. We discharge to Mill Creek. It's about a mile upstream of the Jordan River. And we have formed or leading a collection of POTWs. They're on the right-hand side of the slide. You can see them listed. But we represent these wastewater treatment facilities in a search for a land application site. A little bit about the group. We serve about 2.7 million people collectively. It's about 80% of Utah's population. So I'm imagining probably most of us on this call, you discharge to one of these treatment facilities on the list here. Collectively, we treat about 245 million gallons per day of wastewater and produce 42,000 dry metric tons of biosolids per year. That is an incredible amount of material. This is a problem that's not going away. It's ever present as far as the disposal of biosolids. And as population increases, the amount of wastewater increases and the amount of solids that need to be disposed also increase. So it's a ever-present challenge that we're faced with. So you might be asking yourself, what are biosolids? So dirty water comes into the treatment plant, clean water leaves, and the solids that are removed from that process, they go through further treatment to remove the contaminants and viruses and bacteria and things like that. We give that term biosolids. So they are treated to a high standard. They're safe for recycling and beneficial reuse. Of course, with wastewater, they come from everyone. So they come from me, they come from you, and they come every day. So it's, as I said, ever current, ever present challenge. Biosolids treatment and disposal is heavily regulated from both the EPA and Division of Water Quality. On the right-hand side, I wanted to just highlight, when we talk about biosolids, we're usually also talking about beneficial reuse of biosolids. And the picture on the right is a site up in West Weber County that has been applied with biosolids, which is the green lush fields that you see there, juxtaposed to a field that has not been applied with biosolids. So biosolids essentially is providing the nutrients, nitrogen. It's essentially a soil amendment and fertilizer, and does an amazing job of increasing plant growth. Go ahead, Leland. So a couple photos on the left are a couple photos on the bottom are how we apply the biosolids. A tractor and a spreader is really what's used. We like to apply these to farming areas, crop grazing, rangeland is where this typically likes to go. We've worked with a number of large landowners in the past, Skull Valley at the Ensign Ranch, Fox Hill County with Joe Ferry. The majority of the material from both Central Valley and a lot of other plants goes to West Weber County, to the Marriott properties. and is land applied there. What we've found through the years is that the farmers that we do work with, they value the material. It's beneficial to their property, and it is put to beneficial use there. Next slide. So as a group, we are having an issue with where we can take biosolids. So what's been happening is the state's been growing, and the areas that were once fields that could be applied are being developed. The largest site that the majority of us go to, which is the west or up the Marriott properties, is now become the designated as the West Weber Inland Port. That's about 9,000 acres in Weber County. It's the current land site for about 1.2 million people, including Central Valley and those listed below. Some people ask, why don't you just, if you're not able to land apply, why don't you landfill this material? And there's a couple of reasons why that's difficult to do. For one, it's very expensive to take it to the landfill. The landfills themselves are tight on space, so they don't even want to take the material if they do take it. And we feel like it's that material, since it is a fertilizer and soil amendment, can be put to better use than taking up space in a landfill. As a group, we are looking for this long-term solution. We typically look out 25, 50 to 100 years to make sure that we always have a place to take the solids that can be applied. We feel that the optimum solution would be an area that we all own and can manage ourselves. Some of the attributes of a good land application site that we're looking for is large tract of land, 50,000 acres. We essentially want land that nobody else wants. So we're looking for land that really isn't developable. It's far enough away that it wouldn't be in that realm. Hauling distance is a major cost factor for us. So we're kind of looking around that 75-mile haul distance. It's helpful if the property has some vegetative cover, some grass, sagebrush, things like that to uptake the nutrients, the phosphorus and nitrogen that we're removing and that are in the biosolids. Flat slopes help control runoff. So we look at slopes with areas less than 6%. We don't need water, so a lot of these plots are not irrigated. The biosolids themselves do help to contain the moisture on the land. So we've been reaching out really for about the past year and a half to look at different sites where we could take biosolids and looking at support for this land acquisition initiatives. We've worked some with the Natural Resources Committee, that's Senator Sandals' group. We currently have a demonstration plot in Box Elder County that's ongoing. We've reached out to SITLA and the BLM through the feds to also look at property that could be acquired. That if you know those processes, they take time, but we're looking at a combination of trading, transfer, or purchasing property to come up with the required acreage. Next slide. So again, if you have any questions or want further information from us, there's our contact information listed. This is the Wasatch Front Water Quality Council, Phil Heck, our GM, myself, and Leland Myers. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have and really appreciate any support this group's able to give for this problem that we all share.